Part 5. St. Paisi Velichkovsky. St. Paisi Velichkovsky, a great hesychist father. St. Paisi Velichkovsky, who lived from 1722 to 1794, was a major figure in monasticism. He lived as a monk for some years on the Holy Mountain, and then in the Slavic countries, mostly Ukraine, Moldavia, and Wallachia. The scope of his work, however, extended to the whole area of the Balkans, Russia, and other regions. He was an amazing prophetic figure in 18th century monasticism. After monasticism in the Balkans and Russia had been altered by the reforms under Peter the Great, when the Western spirit of the Enlightenment and Romanticism flowed into Russia, he restored it to its ancient patristic sources. From my reading, I was broadly familiar with St. Paisi Velichkovsky's work and teaching. In particular, I knew that he had lived for a time on the Holy Mountain, and that he had translated into Slavonic the texts by the Holy Fathers of the Church referring to the hesychistic tradition, purification of the heart, illumination of the nous, and deification that constitute the well-known Philokalia. Not only did he find and translate these important texts, but he also put them into practice. As a result, he attracted many monks who wanted to live this hesychist tradition. He taught them this tradition and became their spiritual teacher in the hesychistic life. Emeritus Professor Anthony Emil Takios of the Theological School of Thessaloniki for many years taught the history of the Slavic and other Orthodox churches, specializing in the hesychistic tradition in the Balkans and Russia. The subject of his doctoral thesis was Influences of Hesychism on Ecclesiastical Politics in Russia. He also studied St. Paisi Velichkovsky, and the postdoctoral dissertation he submitted with his application for a lectureship was entitled Paisi Velichkovsky and his ascetical philological school. These and other studies of his revealed the life and work of this great Ukrainian ascetic. More recently, in 2009, the same professor published a book entitled St. Paisi Velichkovsky, published by University Studio Press in Thessaloniki. This book, containing the autobiography and biography of this great Ukrainian hesychist monk, had already been published in other languages and has now been published in Greek. I regard this as a very important book. It is divided into 3 chapters. The first comprises the autobiography of St. Paisi Velichkovsky, which covers the period up until his move to the Holy Mountain. Second chapter contains the biography of St. Paisi written by his disciple, Hieromonk Metrophanes, which starts from the point where the autobiography is interrupted and ends with the death of this great hesychist father. St. Paisi's own account to Abba Theodosius of the Sophronian Hermitage in Russia of the discovery on the Holy Mountain of the writings of the Niptic Fathers and their translation into Slavonic is published in the 3rd chapter. In the introduction to the whole work, Professor Anthony Emil Takeos, with scholarly accuracy and specialist knowledge, makes appropriate comments on the texts that follow, particularly on the autobiography of St. Paisi Velichkovsky, which the ever-memorable Valentinia Pilin discovered at the holy monastery of Seku, and which the professor translated. Significant comments helpful to the reader are included in the footnotes to the texts. There is a bibliography at the end of the book that demonstrates how great a contribution St. Paisi made. This is a very significant work that ought to be read by all those interested in these matters, because it is connected with the revival of monasticism in Moldavia, Romania, Russia, and the wider area. It is well known that St. Paisi's translation of these important Niptic texts into Slavonic and their subsequent translation into Vlach Romanian helped many monks to live this hesychistic tradition. It was this Slavonic Philokalia which the pilgrim himself in the famous book The Way of the Pilgrim had in mind. The following pages will highlight 5 aspects of the life of this great Ukrainian Niptic and hesychist saint of our church. 1. His path to monasticism. St. Paisy's baptismal name was Peter, and he was born in Poltava in Ukraine, Little Russia, as Ukraine was called, in 1722. He lost his father at the age of 4. At the age of 10, he was reading the Old and New Testaments, the book Pearls by St. John Chrysostom, St. Ephrem the Syrian, Abba Dorotheus, and other books. Through this reading, he conceived a love for monasticism. While he was studying in Kiev, he showed more zeal for spiritual matters than for the scholastic lessons that were taught at that time at the ecclesiastical school. He describes a characteristic dialogue with his headmaster, which shows his early enthusiasm for the patristic hesychistic tradition. He would visit the lavra of the Kiev caves, and inspired by the monastic life and asceticism of the monks, his love for monasticism grew, particularly his love for the eremitical life, completely detached from the world. Anyone reading his account notices the great zeal for hesychistic monasticism that developed in his adolescence. There are some phrases that he uses in his autobiography which show the love for monasticism, particularly hesychistic monasticism, which dominated his soul. He relates, quote, "Love for monasticism prevailed in my soul. No longer did it push me to attend lessons, but it impelled me to renounce the world and become a monk as quickly as possible. I would come to the lavra in the evenings, and as I was a stranger and did not know anyone there, I would pass the night either somewhere in the nearest cave close to the church or in the large monastery near to the big bell tower, where I remained until the bell rang for the canon. I blessed, thrice blessed, Hezekiah. The desire for something unobtainable so inflamed my soul that if it were possible, I should not have wanted to at any cost to leave those sacred caves, but to remain there and to end my life in them. Seeing, however, that this was impossible, I departed from those holy caves, grieving and sighing." End quote. St. Paisi Velichkovsky. He, together with fellow pupils at the school who had the same desire, promised, quote, "to live in exile from our homeland in a deserted and quiet place, and once we'd found an experienced guide for our souls, to devote ourselves to obedience to him, and when the appropriate time came, to receive monastic tonsure from him." End quote. They decided to live until our last breath in monastic poverty and in hardship. He sought out ascetics and hermit fathers and benefited from their presence and their words. Standing nearby, he says, "I would hear salutary words which seemed to me to be words of eternal life." In order to satisfy his great longing to live as a monk in exile, in Hezekiah, in hardship, he abandoned his studies in Kiev and took leave of his mother in an atmosphere charged with tender emotion. His zeal for the monastic life is astounding, as is his strong will to fulfill his desire. The reader is amazed by the account of his sufferings as he searched for a suitable place, his visits to various monastic centers, and his meetings with hermits, whom he wanted to obey for the sake of his salvation, the hermit Hesychios being a typical example. St. Paisi crossed rivers, forests, and national boundaries with many difficulties and unimaginable, indescribable torments. When he joined a monastery as a novice, the abbot suggested that if he wished, he might wear some monastic garments. He relates, quote, "I bowed low before him, taking his blessing, and went to my cell. I took off my secular clothes and put on those that the abbot had given me with such joy that I kissed them over and over again as though they were something sacred. I wore them continuously until they were reduced to rags on me, and I gave thanks to God that instead of the secular clothes that I had worn until then, I'd been found worthy of proper monastic clothes." End quote. His search for somewhere suitable took him to the monastery of St. Nicholas, which is on the river Tiamiznia and is called Medvedovsky. Excuse the pronunciation. There he received the small monastic schema and was given the name Platon. The persecution that broke out against the monastery, however, with regional officials putting pressure on the monks to become uniates, made it necessary for him to return to the Lavra of the Kiev caves. While he was there, his soul benefited from the presence of great ascetic fathers, whose asceticism and virtues were outstanding. He relates to a certain monk, quote, "The mere sight of him did my wretched soul good," end quote. Referring to the great ascetics, he narrates, quote, "Seeing and reflecting on these things, I was completely ablaze with love for this holy place, and I thanked God with my whole heart that he had accounted me worthy, unworthy as I am, to find myself in such a holy lavra." These ascetics, however, did not usually consent to guide others, whereas he was seeking a guide for his spiritual life. Thus, he searched for such a guide in Moldavia, passing through various regions knee-deep in snow and confronting unexpected difficulties when he crossed borders with his traveling companions. On his journey, he met many good ascetics who lived in profound and rigorous asceticism. He writes at one point, quote, "The brethren used to gather together with the elder and discuss until midnight. I, the least of all, used to sit with them, listening carefully to what was said, rejoicing inexpressibly, and glorifying God with tears, because he had accounted me worthy in my youth to hear from the mouth of so spiritual a man such beneficial words that guided me throughout my life." In the Cernal Skeet, St. Paisi met ascetics and hermit fathers who lived in the Hesychist tradition. There, he was taught, quote, "what is meant by work and theoria, and true noetic Hesychia." He not only learnt there the spiritual vigilance and attention accomplished in the heart through the nous and noetic prayer, but he also relished in his heart the divine energy motivated by it. Divine providence, however, wanted St. Paisi on the holy mountain, quote, "so that he would add to the treasure and give abundantly to all those seeking to benefit from his spiritual teaching." He was seeking there an experienced spiritual father living in Hesychia, to whom he would devote himself, soul and body, in obedience, so as to learn the method of the spiritual life from him. He arrived at the great Lavra and celebrated the feast of St. Athanasios with the fathers. From there, he went to the Skeet of the Pantocrator monastery. He settled in a small hermitage and looked for a suitable spiritual guide. He lived very ascetically, with prostrations, self-control, complete lack of possessions, poverty, hardship even regards his bed, contrition of heart, unceasing prayer, love for God and his neighbor, remembrance of death, psalmody, and reading Holy Scripture, but also with continuous weeping, because he did not find a Hesychist spiritual father to obey. Practicing asceticism in this way, he went from strength to strength spiritually, lifting his heart ever and ever higher. Thus, aflame with divine zeal for great ascetic struggles, he relished Hesychia for 2.5 years. At that point, around 1750, he received the great angelic schema. He was then 28 years old, and his name was then changed from Platon to Paisi. As he did not have a suitable spiritual father, he followed the teaching of the Holy Fathers of the Church, which he read in their writings. Thus, his zeal for the monastic life, which had developed in him from an early age, found fulfillment in the gift of the great monastic schema, his love for sacred Hesychia and the monastic life. 2. Searching for and translating the writings of the Hesychist Fathers. St. Paisi, enlightened by God, grasped the great importance of Holy Scripture and the Niptic and Hesychistic writings of the Holy Fathers, which he'd studied since childhood. As he read these texts, his zeal to acquire communion with God increased. While he was still a novice at the monastery of Lubek, a monk who had given him the Ladder of Divine Ascent by St. John Climacus to read. This brought him great joy. In order to have it with him continuously, he would spend all night copying it out by the light of a flaming torch that filled his cell with smoke. St. Paisi relates that he acquired this love for patristic books because in the absence of a suitable spiritual guide, he wanted to prevent not only himself but also the monks for whom he would eventually take responsibility from deviating from the correct way of thinking of the one holy Catholic and Apostolic Church. Limiting his food and enduring poverty, he began to acquire various patristic books in the Slavic language, which teach about obedience and attention, spiritual vigilance, and prayer. As he read the books that had already been translated into Slavic, he realized that they contained serious errors, which made it impossible to understand the meaning clearly. At first, he attempted to correct them using other books translated into Slavic, but he found this work very difficult and impossible to accomplish. When, however, after staying for many years on the Holy Mountain, he learned the Greek language to some extent, he searched out the Niptic books written in the original Greek so that he could correct the Slavonic books. He realized that this too, however, was so difficult as to be impossible. He visited the sketes, including the skete of St. Anna and the skete of St. Demetrios belonging to the Holy Monastery of Vatopedi and the monasteries of the Holy Mountain, as well as experienced elders, in order to find books referring to the hesychastic and Niptic life, such as the writings of St. Philotheus of Sinai and St. Hezekias the priest. But no one knew of their existence. This distressed him beyond measure. He tells of the great joy that he felt when walking from the Great Lavra to the skete of St. Anna. He called in at the skete of St. Basil, and he met a monk who was copying the books of St. Peter of Damascus, St. Anthony the Great, St. Gregory of Sinai, St. Philotheus, St. Hezekias, St. Diodocus of Photiki, St. Thalassios, St. Simeon the New Theologian, St. Nicephorus the Solitary, St. Isaiah, and many others. After many entreaties and much expense, he acquired many Niptic texts of this sort, and he returned to Moldavia to organize the large community that had meanwhile gathered. There he devoted himself to the translation of these Niptic texts. At first he tried to correct the texts that had been already translated into Slavonic by using the original Greek texts, as this was difficult because the earlier translations had not even translated them originally well. He began making entirely new translations. St. Paisi translated the texts from Greek into Slavonic, the language that was prevalent in the 17th century in books published in Russia. He himself confesses, "This work was beyond my strength." His biographer and disciple Metrophanes says that St. Paisi translated from the Greek language into our own Slavonic, and from Slavonic, the Vlach-speaking brethren translated into their language. All day long he was occupied with matters concerning the monastery, and at night he would translate, working beyond the limits of nature, even though his whole body hurt, and he was disabled, suffering greatly from sores. His biographer also tells us the way in which St. Paisi would write at night. Quote, "On the bed where he rested, he was surrounded by books. Lots of dictionaries, the Holy Scripture in Greek, the Holy Scripture in Slavonic, a Greek grammar, a Slavonic grammar, and the book that he was translating, and a lit candle in the middle. Sitting bent over like a little child or lying down, he would write all night long, oblivious of sickness and labor, unable to reply or even hear if they spoke to him or if something happened outside his cell." End quote. He made the translations of the Niptic books included in the Philokalia of the Niptic saints with great zeal. On the one hand, because in them he found the wisdom of the fathers and the way in which one can reach union and communion with God. And on the other hand, in order to give them to his disciples as nourishment for those wishing to be initiated into the teachings of the Holy Fathers. Few have contributed as much as St. Paisi to the renewal of the hesychastic monasticism in Ukraine, Moldavia, Wallachia, Romania, Russia, and other countries. 3. Spiritual guide to hundreds and thousands of monks. Because St. Paisi felt in his heart the sweetness of noetic hesychia and prayer, he drew toward him, without setting out to do so, many people and monks who were seeking this form of spiritual life. He lived for 18 years between 1746 and 1763 on the Holy Mountain. At first he stayed in a small hermitage near the Pantocrator monastery. Quote, aflame with divine zeal for great ascetic struggles, he relished Hezekiah for 2.5 years. Gradually various monks began to gather around him. Thus they were obliged to buy another small hermitage higher up than their present one, and later on they bought the cell of St. Constantine. His community was made up of the Romanian-speaking and Slavic-speaking brethren. Once 20 brethren had gathered there under his spiritual guidance, and they moved to the skete of the prophet Elias. Services were held in 2 languages, Slavonic and Romanian. Their handiwork was making spoons, which they sold to meet their essential needs, but they also offered hospitality to monks. Metrophanes writes, quote, our father was busy with handiwork, producing twice as much as the brethren, but at night he would copy out books. Throughout his life, he spent the night keeping vigil, unable to sleep for more than 3 hours. End quote. His renown had spread throughout the Holy Mountain, and many came to make their confession to him. Even Patriarch Seraphim, who was living at the monastery of Pantocrator at that time. For a short time, he moved with a few monks to the monastery of Simonopetra, but they could not stay there longer because the monastery was in debt. With his way of life, he illumined the whole of the Holy Mountain, and all the Athonite monks admired the radiance of this light. When, however, the community at Prophet Elias increased in number and there was not enough room for them, God took him from there and brought him to this Orthodox country of Moldavia. 66 monks followed him. St. Paisi settled with his monks in the Dragomirna monastery and made enormous efforts to reconstruct it, applying the system of the Holy Mountain. He adjusted the typicon of the community to the typicon and writings of St. Basil. Quote, monks had to carry out their common tasks in silence, saying the Jesus prayer. And in the cells they were to read the works of the God-bearing fathers and pray noetic prayer with the nous in the heart, expertly and precisely, holding their breath with the fear of God, because this is the source of love for God and one's neighbor, as well as the source of all the virtues. End quote. Thoughts were confessed every evening because, quote, this is the basis of salvation, peace, Hezekiah, and love. There were more than 200 monks at that monastery. He instructed them as a father and a teacher of noetic prayer. He taught them ceaselessly, not only during fasting periods, but also on other days. Every day, except on Sundays and feast days, the brethren would gather in the refectory in the evening. They lit the candles, and our father of blessed memory would come and sit in his usual place and open a patristic book. St. Basil the Great, or St. John Climacus, or St. Dorotheus, or St. Theodore the Studite. He would then interpret the passages that he read from his own spiritual experience. They stayed 12 years from 1763 to 1775 at the Dragomirna monastery, during which time, due to the outbreak of the Russo-Turkish War, they helped and served a great number of people who had gathered at the monastery. The typicon that St. Paisi drew up in 1763 for the monastery, quote, provided for the abbot of the monastery to know 3 languages, Greek, Slavic, and Romanian. When, however, the Germans and the Austrians occupied the monastery, and the saint realized that he could not live under the Roman Catholics. With great sorrow and grief, they gradually moved to another monastery of Secu. Metrophanes writes of the community's move from the Dragomirna monastery. Quote, we were driven away by the Germans, and we left the monastery of Dragomirna on our own, lest our Orthodox faith suffer harm from the arch-heretics and their secular authorities, as did indeed happen to the monasteries and the secular and spiritual authorities that stayed there. Reflecting on the life that they had lived at that monastery, he writes, quote, O Dragomirna, sweetness and consolation of our souls, I remember our life in you, But it is better that I keep silent, lest our hearts be filled with bitterness at having lost you. For us you were like a paradise of delight. For us you were like a garden that quickly puts down roots near water, and its flowers give various fragrances and fruits." End of quote from St. Paisi. To continue. In 1775, therefore, they moved from Dragomirna to the monastery of Secu, where they exhausted themselves constructing cells so that all the brotherhood could settle there. It was a peaceful and deserted place. The state of the community, after many struggles over 3 years, reached the level of the previous monastery. This pleased St. Paisi, and he glorified God. Prince Constantine Morusis, however, urged and forced St. Paisi to settle at the monastery of Niemt. The saint did not want to make this move after so many hardships, but he finally gave way to the prince's wish out of obedience. In 1779, part of the community moved to the Niemt. There, St. Paisi had to face new struggles to reconstruct the monasteries. This was a source of difficulty and distress for him. At this monastery, St. Paisi built a hospital and a hostel for the elderly, disabled, and blind people, who used to come and ask him to receive them and give them alms. The number of monks here, together with those who were in the skeets, reached 300. Toward the end of St. Paisi's life at the monastery of Niemt, about 700 monks had gathered around him. The biography of St. Nicodemus of the Holy Mountain, as we shall see below, writes that there were over 1,000 monks under St. Paisi's spiritual direction. Information exists that at the Niemt monastery, quote, monks of a total of 10 nationalities lived. Moldavians, Serbs, Bulgarians, Hungarians, Greeks, Jews, Armenians, Turks, Russians, and Ukrainians. It was at this monastery that the saint passed away in 1794. St. Paisi found the path of hesychism and noetic prayer, and his heart was filled with the grace of God. Subsequently, this life overflowed into his teaching to the monks who flocked from all over to listen to the divine wisdom that issued from his mouth, but above all, from his heart. 4. Experiencing hesychistic monasticism. Reading and translating Niptic and hesychistic books was the answer to the quest that had occupied St. Paisi since his childhood. At the same time, however, it kindled even more his desire for the hesychistic and Niptic way of life. Hieromonk Metrophanes, his biographer and disciple, describes St. Paisi's spirituality in his text. I shall quote a few indicative excerpts that demonstrate this. From his youth, St. Paisi was a vessel of God's election and kept his commandments perfectly. For that reason, his words were powerful, perfect, and full of grace, penetrating the soul, differentiating between good and evil, eradicating the passions, and cultivating the virtues in the souls of those who listened with faith. To end the quote from Metrophanes. To continue from Metrophanes, quote, the grace of the all-Holy Spirit dwelt in him even from his mother's womb, end quote. And he later increased this grace by keeping God's commandments. He was wise from his infancy, quote, while he was still a small child, he was mature in mind and wisdom. Subjecting anger and desire to reason, he alienated his senses from all the beautiful and pleasurable things of this world and regarded them all as rottenness. And he stayed at home and lived in Hezekiah as though he were in the desert of Sinai. From an early age, he was aflame with unspeakable zeal to love the Lord and to abandon everything in the world, even his mother. St. Paisi loved Noetic Hezekiah and the Niptic tradition of the Church. He zealously devoted himself to learning this method of acquiring union with God. The natural gifts that he possessed, as well as the fruit of Hezekiah prayer, were easy to discern. Quote, it is impossible to describe his acuteness of mind and memory, strengthened by grace. He was quick to understand the loftiest dogmatic issues, and if he read them once, he retained them forever in his memory, end quote. And, quote, this wonderful man, our father of blessed memory, truly equaled the ancient Holy Fathers in every respect. He was like the early hermits. Quote, "If we compare him with the saints of the desert who practice Hezekiah in solitude, we will not be surprised that he rejoiced so much in prayer and union with God. His nous was always calm and burning with love and union with God. Whatever happened outside his cell, he heard nothing. He kept vigil in his cell with noetic prayer and spiritual vigilance. Quote, just as the saintly hermit stayed awake in spiritual vigilance all night long, so he too stayed awake all night in vigil throughout his life, in no way falling short of the God-bearing fathers in their ascetic struggle." He also resembled, quote, "the saintly Cenobitic fathers of old in many respects. The Holy Spirit dwelt within him, and from his lips, quote, flowed a honey-sweet stream of godly teachings, which softened and healed souls and wiped away passions. He had a divine nous that enabled him to understand the canons of the ecumenical councils and the traditions of the Church correctly." End quote. He was unshakable in his faith and hope in God's providence. With the fear of God, he kept God's commandments as the apple of his eye. And quote again from Metrophanes, "He possessed ardent love for Christ, and its flame poured out toward everyone, without distinction, loving, encouraging, and teaching all, sympathizing with all. His soul not only embraced his spiritual children, but everyone who approached him." To continue, quote, "He was always at peace with everyone. He was never at enmity with anyone and never grieved anyone. He was exceedingly humble and self-controlled. Although his guilelessness and simplicity were childlike, his nous was divine and not like a child's. His face was like that of an angel." Metrophanes, who lived close to St. Paisi, also describes his whole presence as his body too had been transformed by the grace of God dwelling within him. Quote, "His face was radiant, like that of an angel of God, his gaze peaceful, his speech humble and free from any sort of presumption. He greeted everyone with love and answered them gently. He was full of kindness, eager to give alms, and he drew everyone to him as a magnet naturally attracts iron. He was profoundly humble and meek and patient with everyone. This great man was completely inspired by God and full of grace. His nous was always united with God, and his tears bore witness to this. When he spoke about theology, his heart pulsed with love. His face shone with joy, his eyes filled with tears in confirmation of the truth. When we stood before him, our eyes did not tire of looking at him. We could not look at him enough. Our ears never wearied of hearing him speak, nor did we grow bored, because, as I said, we completely forgot ourselves on account of the joy in our hearts." End of quote from Hieromonk Metrophanes. Metropolitan Hierotheus continues, his biographer also describes some miraculous events that he experienced while observing St. Paisi. On one occasion, Metrophanes entered his cell and spoke to him, but he was lying down without moving and did not hear. Then, as Metrophanes relates, quote, "As I stood and waited, I looked at him and saw that his face seemed to be on fire. And since, however, by nature his face was white and pale, I realized that the flame of his heart, due to his love of prayer, had also pervaded his face. On another occasion, he saw his face shining, quote, due to his spiritual joy. He smiled with unspeakable love as he spoke, uttering spiritual words from within. It was as though he were instilling joy into our souls." St. Paisi also had the gift of foresight, and whatever he foresaw came about. What is more, while he was in his cell, he was aware of the state of all the brethren of the monastery. He even did miracles. Quote, "Our father of blessed memory wrought many miracles, but as he did not even want to hear about that subject and attributed everything to the most honorable God, I too will stop, so as not to go against him, although I know of many miracles both before and after his death." As someone with many spiritual gifts, Hezekiah, noetic prayer, but also the gift of teaching, he gathered many monks around him. In this way, he renewed the monasticism of his time, bringing it into the Niptic tradition of the fathers of the Church. Most monks in his era, apart from some radiant exceptions whom he himself met in the caves of the Kiev Lavra and elsewhere had changed to such an extent that they only retained the outward form of monasticism. Quote, they did not know what monasticism is or what the mystery of obedience is and how much it benefits the disciple who approaches it knowingly, or what is meant by praxis, spiritual work, vision, and noetic prayer, which takes place in the nous through the heart. He himself was taught these things by God and from the teachings of the Holy Fathers by reading and translating their writings. 5. His saintly decease. The death of such a saint was worthy of his life. He lived his whole life in Hezekiah and noetic prayer, and it was fitting that he should finish his life and pass into eternity in the same way. According to the testimony of Metrophanes, his biographer, quote, many days beforehand he was informed by the Lord concerning his death, because he stopped translating patristic books. End quote. Metrophanes visited him in his cell and found him particularly joyful. He asked St. Paisi 4 difficult theological questions, and he gave him good explanations. When he left his cell, the brother who served him locked the door and did not let anyone in. The next day he fell ill. Then he did not allow anyone to knock on the door, lest his condition be made worse. He suffered for 3 days, and on Sunday, when he felt better, he went to the Divine Liturgy. He returned to his cell with great difficulty. Quote, from then on, his illness became worse, and no one was allowed to visit him, as our father of blessed memory wanted to depart in Hezekiah. Quote, when the end came, he partook of the most pure mysteries. After having summoned 2 spiritual fathers through whom he conveyed blessing and peace to all the brothers, he departed as though he had fallen asleep, and committed his soul into God's hands, leaving the brotherhood to elect an elder and shepherd in accordance with the decision of the communal assembly. When the death of St. Paisi became known, a large number of monks, married priests, and simple people gathered, and we all lamented together. We buried him with honors inside the church. He died on the 15th of November, 1794. His saintly life ended with a saintly death. His life was hesychastic, and so was his death and departure to the Lord. 6. The Philocalic movement in the Orthodox world. Without this being his aim, St. Paisi Velichkovsky was linked with a very significant development observable in the Orthodox world in the 18th century, the so-called, quote, Philocalic Renaissance, which played an important role in the regeneration of the Orthodox tradition, as well as revealing new holy fathers and new martyrs. As we know, in Europe in the 18th century, an ideological trend called the Enlightenment evolved, which distanced itself from the worldview of Western Christianity and relied on the ancient Greek philosophers and writers. Enlightened views of this sort, though in more moderate form, were brought to Greece by Greek influenced by the Enlightenment, such as Adamantios Koreas, who was interested in publishing the works of the ancient Greek philosophers and writers. At this period in the Greek-speaking world, the so-called Kollevadis movement, or the Philocalic Fathers, made their appearance. They included St. Macarius Notaras, St. Nicodemus of the Holy Mountain, St. Athanasios of Paros, and others. And they went in the opposite direction to the followers of the Enlightenment, searching for and publishing the writings of the fathers of the Church, and above all, texts referring to Orthodox Hezekiah, which is the only method by which God is known. St. Macarius, who lived from, say, 1731 to 1805, the former metropolitan of Corinth, we know as St. Macarius of Corinth, worked hard to find and collect together the writings of the Nyptic Fathers of the Church. He entitled this compilation, Philokalia of the Nyptic Saints. St. Paisi refers to this great Hesychid bishop who went to the Holy Mountain to search out and collect these Nyptic texts. It is striking that St. Paisi writes, among other things, quote, when he, St. Macarius, came to the Holy Mountain, end quote. We know, however, that St. Macarius was on the Holy Mountain in 1775, whereas St. Paisi had left there in 1763. By using the word came, St. Paisi shows that he felt and acted as a monk of the Holy Mountain, although he was living in Moldavia at that time. St. Paisi speaks in glowing terms of St. Macarius, former Bishop of Corinth, as they shared the same desire and the same quest. He writes, quote, "His Eminence Macarius, former Metropolitan of Corinth, with God's cooperation, possessed from his youth indescribable love for the patristic writings referring to spiritual vigilance, the attention of the nous, Hezekiah, and Noetic prayer, which takes place in the heart of those who practice it. For this reason, he devoted his whole life to searching for such writings. With his hard work and his experience in secular learning, he ordered copies of them, sparing no expense." He goes on to relate how Bishop Macarius searched all the libraries of the monasteries of the Holy Mountain, and how he found the inestimable treasure in the monastery of Vatopedi, quote, namely a book about uniting the nous with God, an anthology from all the saints which had been made in earlier times by people with great zeal, as well as other writings that were previously unknown. Bishop Macarius copied them out with the help of experienced copyists, read them carefully from the original, and corrected them authoritatively. He also wrote a brief biography of the saints who composed the texts. Quote, "He then left the Holy Mountain with unspeakable joy, as though he had found a heavenly treasure on earth, and once he had arrived in the glorious city of Smyrna in Asia Minor, he sent them to Venice with a large sum of money that he had collected from charitable contributions made by Christians, quote, to be published. St. Paisi praises St. Macarius for this important work that he accomplished, because he understood the worth of these writings, quote, and he spent almost the whole of his life searching diligently everywhere for these writings, but especially on the holy mountain of Athos. End quote. In fact, as St. Paisi writes, for athletes of the monastic life in their struggle with the unseen spirits, these writings are actually, quote, more essential than breathing. St. Nicodemus of the Holy Mountain, who lived from 1749 to 1809, also helped in the publication of the Philokalia at the prompting of St. Macarius, former Bishop of Corinth, when he visited the Holy Mountain in 1777 and met him. Hero monk Euthemius, a spiritual brother of St. Nicodemus of the Holy Mountain, refers to this exact event, quote, in 1777, Bishop Macarius of Corinth came, and after venerating the holy monasteries, he came to Kériez and was welcomed as a guest at St. Anthony by a monk from the same place as him, Elder David. While there, he also summoned Nicodemus and besought him to look at the Philokalia. This is how the blessed man began, but what did he begin? I am at a loss for words. Should I say spiritual struggles or excessive mental and physical labors? It was not just these things, but others as well, which my mind is inadequate to grasp. What I am saying is that he began the Philokalia. And we can see his very fine preface and his brief, eloquent lives of the inspired fathers, end quote. This authoritative biographer of St. Nicodemus of the Holy Mountain also provides us with important evidence that St. Nicodemus had heard of St. Paisi Velichkovsky, wanted to visit him. Quote, while he was there in the monastery of Dionysiu, he heard good reports of Paisi the Russian, the head of a monastic community in Moldavia who had over 1,000 brethren under his supervision and who taught unceasing Noetic prayer. Because he too loved this sacred work, he embarked on a ship in order to go in search of the divine prayer that he loved. As they were sailing outside Athens, they were caught in a storm and were in danger until they reached the harbor of Panagia in Thasos. There he disembarked and changed his plans, ostensibly on account of the storm. But the truth is that a sign from God brought him back so that he would undertake this great good work for Christ's church. This obviously refers to the preparation of various patristic texts for publication. What is particularly impressive here is the communication between these three great figures of that era: St. Paisi Velichkovsky, St. Macarius, former Bishop of Corinth, and St. Nicodemus of the Holy Mountain. All three loved the hesychastic tradition and life, and regarded it as the essence of Orthodox ecclesiastical life. They struggled to track down and discover the Niptic writings of the Hesychist Fathers and did everything possible to publish and distribute them. Above all, they loved noetic hesychia and noetic prayer of the heart, and they understood how important these were for uniting man's nous with God. This is what made them saints in the consciousness of the people and in the life of the Church. St. Paisi Velichkovsky also writes about the contribution of the Greek Orthodox Church to the Russian Church, quote, "By God's inexpressible love for humankind, our Russian Church was counted worthy in the last times to receive the Holy Orthodox faith and Orthodox baptism from the Greek Orthodox Church. Together with the Holy Faith, we also received the Holy Scripture and all the sacred books translated from Greek, ecclesiastical books, the writings of the Holy Fathers and teachers. These are the sources of the Slavic books. Otherwise, no Slavic books would have come into existence." End quote. The Philocalic Fathers, St. Macarius, St. Nicodemus of the Holy Mountain, and others contributed to the renewal of Hesychistic monasticism and the Hesychistic tradition. This renewal went against the current of the Enlightenment, which sought the return of New Hellenism to ancient Greece, holding all the intervening Byzantine Roman patristic period in contempt. St. Paisi Velichkovsky likewise offered positive resistance to the entire trend of the Enlightenment that had entered Russia and the surrounding region, as he himself had encountered it in the ecclesiastical school of Kiev as a student there. In his study, titled Paisi Velichkovsky and His Ascetical Philological School, Emeritus Professor Anthony Emil Takeos, after studying the sources, provides important information about the publication of the Philokalia in Greek and its translation into Slavonic, as well as linking the parallel efforts of St. Paisi and St. Macarius, Bishop of Corinth. To compensate for the lack of a spiritual guide and to enable him to direct his community, St. Paisi was already interested in finding, studying, and translating the Niptic texts of the Hesychist Fathers. His efforts have been described above. After he had left the Holy Mountain and was in Moldavia, he heard about the parallel initiative by St. Macarius to find and collect together writings by the Niptic Fathers. This information reached him through his disciple, the monk Gregory, who was with St. Macarius. When the Greek edition of the Philokalia was published in 1782, St. Paisi received a copy of it. Both he and his monks then revised their translations of many patristic texts. Once the translation of the patristic texts had been completed, the Slavonic Philokalia was published at the Synodal Printing Press in Moscow in the year 1793, 11 years after the Greek edition of the Philokalia. The Slavonic Philokalia included the writings of 24 out of the total of 36 writers in the Greek edition. Later on, the Slavonic Philokalia was translated into Romanian and Russian. The same professor, in a specific chapter entitled, quote, "The Monastery of Optina as the Spiritual Heir of the School of St. Paisi Velichkovsky," records how after the Treaty of 1779, Kainarka, and later after the death of St. Paisi, Russian monks who were disciples of St. Paisi were repatriated to Russia, taking the hesychistic spirit of St. Paisi with them. As well as the spoken tradition, they took manuscripts of the translations of ascetic works that had been prepared by the school of the monastery of Nyemph. These disciples of St. Paisi assumed various positions in Russian monasteries, becoming abbots and spiritual fathers, and this helped in the development of hesychistic monasticism. It has been estimated that 103 monasteries in Russia were influenced by the spirit of hesychistic monasticism as expressed by St. Paisi Velichkovsky. Optina Monastery, however, proved to be the heir par excellence of the great ascetic tradition of the school of Paisi Velichkovsky. The monastery of Optina was at the height of its renown in the days of hero monk Macarius from 1788 to 1860. In his time, the monastery undertook the publication of ascetic writings, quote, which Russia had inherited from the school of Paisi. This was an important period in Russia, because rationalism and German philosophy were being introduced from the West and influencing many intellectuals. It was to be expected, then, that in parallel with the Western German Enlightenment, the hesychistic tradition of the Church, as expressed by St. Paisi, would be developed. Thus, two trends evolved within Russian society, that of the Western Enlightenment and that of hesychism, coming from the Slavophiles, as we also plainly encounter in Elder Zosimo and the Brother Karamazov by Fyodor Dostoevsky. In this novel, Dostoevsky presents the dominant trends in Russia at that period. The three sons of Fyodor Karamazov, Mitya Dmitri, Ivan, and Alexei Alosha, express the three currents within Russian society. Mitya symbolizes the ancient, indigenous, emotional, and sensuous Russia. Ivan represents the Russian intelligentsia, who had been influenced by Western Enlightenment. He himself was an intellectual and agnostic and representative of speculative thinkers. Alyosha stands for the intellectual world that has been influenced by Orthodox spirituality and expressed the Slavophile mentality. As for Starets Zosimo, as Dostoevsky describes him, he expresses Makarios and Ambrose of the monastery of Aptina and its whole tradition. The 103 Russian monasteries, particularly Aptina, were centers for studying the Philokalia and patristic texts. Monastery of Aptina greatly influenced Russian society and the intellectual world because, apart from the common people, it was frequented by theologians, literary figures, and writers such as Alexei Komyakov, Nikolai Gogol, Leo Tolstoy, and others. Thus, the tradition created by the remarkable St. Paisi influenced monks up to and including St. Seraphim of Sarovsky, who is regarded as the saint's spiritual descendant, as well as theologians, writers, and philosophers. In conclusion, the course of St. Paisi Veleshkovsky's life from 1722 to 1794 arouses admiration and surprise. His mother wanted to direct him toward marriage and the priesthood, so that in this way the family surname would endure in history. As St. Paisi relates, this was because his mother had lost her husband, who was a priest, and only he remained of her children, quote, the only one to take care of the house in her old age and to be a godly consolation. St. Paisi, however, took another path, and finally he saved thousands of people. He proved to be a new Moses in Moldavia, Wallachia, Russia, and all the surrounding region, so his family name has remained eminent for centuries. Even his own mother, after her initial distress, she became a nun, died as a nun. St. Paisi took his zeal for the hesychistic life to the Holy Mountain, but he also benefited from the hesychistic tradition that already existed there. Although forgotten by many, it was preserved in the libraries and by isolated ascetics. This shows that the patristic teaching is the same down through the centuries and is essentially the theology of the prophets, the apostles, and the Holy Fathers. Neither scholastic theology nor so-called neo-patristic Russian theology can surpass this Orthodox theology. Professor Anthony Emil Takeos writes very aptly in the foreword to the book, to quote, the study of the revival of hesychist spirituality in the Orthodox world during the 18th century leads inevitably to the figure of the great ascetic and monastic leader St. Paisius Veleshkovsky, who reintroduced the Slavic and Romanian world to the realm of this form of spiritual life. It was St. Paisi who contributed to the revival of the Cenobitic life in Romanian monasticism, based on the Athonite prototype and Typicon, and to move toward hesychistic spirituality as this had flourished on the Holy Mountain in the 14th century. His work to this end was a parallel effort with that undertaken in the Greek world by his contemporary St. Makarios, whose work served as an example for Paisi. I should like once more to thank and congratulate Emeritus Professor Anthony Emil Takeos for everything he has contributed to the Church, but particularly for presenting the life and the works of St. Paisi Veleshkovsky, who is a brilliant child of the life that exists abundantly within the Orthodox Church.